It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.
Well, hello, greetings. Another edition here of Islands at War. Keith Bengelli here, and I'm joined, of course, by Nick Lahiri. Hi, Nick.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. So, Nick, we're up to November 1941, and got a lot to get through today. So, Nick's going to do quite a lot of talking. I'm going to try and tee things up for him. But straight in, we go with Dr. Fritz Todt. Comes to the Channel Islands to scope out fortifications and organise the French workforce. So, Nick, give the listeners an idea of who Dr. Fritz Todt was.
So he was head of the Todt organisation, which I'm sure many people will have heard of, which was basically the construction arm of the German government, effectively. So they built the autobahns pre-war and things like that, but then obviously branched out into another line of business when it came to the war. So he actually personally visited the Channel Islands in November 41, a follow-on from, of course, you'll remember in the last episode, October 41, we mentioned the fortification order that Hitler had given. Well, he was here to personally assess what fortifications would be needed to meet Hitler's requirements to make this a fortress.
So I've always sort of thought of the organisation, Todd, as a sort of quasi-military. Can you just sort of place it in the sort of general firmament of the German forces? Was it civilian-based or was it half and half? I mean, or did it? Could you just sort of give us some background?
I think the answer is it's complicated. But it depends which part of the war you're talking about to a certain extent as well. But a lot of people will probably be familiar with the fact that, some of the organisation Todt people were armed. They wore uniforms. They didn't always wear uniforms, but some of them were armed. And they could be armed with anything from a whip to a pistol to, some other form of weapon.
And also, they could enter military areas where civilians couldn't. They had a degree of access to military points and sites.
Yeah, to a certain extent, not all of them. So they weren't allowed into things like the Soldatenheims and things like that. The sort of rest and recuperation stroke social clubs. They weren't allowed in there. So they had their own quarters. They weren't, along with the German troops or anything like that. And they had varying roles. So you had people that worked for the organisation who were paid. We've kind of covered this before a little bit.
Yeah.
People who were volunteers who were paid, people who were sort of volunteers, which we'll come to in a minute with some French people that were involved. Yes. And then you had the slave workers who were basically forced political prisoners or being persecuted for their religion.
Yeah. So organisation Todt, though, they weren't architects. They didn't plan the bunkers. They simply provided the workforce to build bunkers and other military installations. They weren't architects. They didn't design them. Those were designed by military planners. An organisation, Todd.
No, it was
carried out the work. Yeah, it's almost like one of those programs where they completely redo a house in 3 days or something. Into it.
Very much. So he was here because he'd been ordered, been told, right, we need to turn the Channel Islands into a fortress or a Festung, as it's called in German. And he was sent here to work out what he needed to do to meet Hitler's requirements and also to supervise the arrival of 16,000 workers.
This is across the Channel Islands, not just in Guernsey.
Yeah, across the Channel Islands. And he visited all of the Channel Islands. So I mentioned the French workers that were arriving.
Sorry, can we just go back to Fritz Todt? Because he is quite an enigmatic character as well, because he perished in an air crash. Was there some sort of controversy around that?
Yeah, you get lots of theories about that. You could spend hours on that.
Right. Okay. So we just draw a line under it. So he died in contested circumstances.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's probably the best way to
go.
What
we do know is he's dead.
Yeah, very much so. So I mentioned the French workers. They were some of the first workers that came here. Now, these guys had volunteered, in inverted commas.
Yes.
So they had these bureaus in France where they were recruiting people to go and work for the Germans. And people joined for various reasons. You know, there was a lot of unemployment in France. So it was an attractive way to make money. The Germans were paying, supposedly, quite well to do that. And as far as a lot of them were concerned, they were volunteering to go and work locally in their local department in France.
Yes, because when you think about it, the French army had been made redundant.
Well, yeah, there's another aspect to this in that a deal was done with the Vichy government that for every 3 that volunteered, they'd release 1 prisoner of war. They reneged on that anyway. And I recently read something that said it was more like 1 for every 100.
Yes, yeah.
But anyway, they thought they were signing up to work in a lot of cases in their local department in France.
Yeah.
And very soon found out that was actually not the case. I've just been looking at one chap, actually, who escaped from Guernsey, which I'm working on for the book, which is from later on in the war. He immediately gets shipped to a place just outside of Paris, then to St. Malo, and then here, which all turned out to be a bit of a surprise for him. Anyway, going back to these guys in November 41, a lot of the diaries talk about them already looking in a fairly bad state of affairs. These guys were being paid. So they're not, the slave workers that typically you see talked about later on. But already in November 41, we know that there was trouble with getting food full stop. They start having problems getting their rations when they get here, because one of the other things they were promised was good food and accommodation, which also turned out not to be true, unsurprisingly. So a lot of them, when they arrived here, found, particularly the first ones that arrived here, ended up billeted in houses. But when they got taken to the house, they found that it was just nothing in there. It was completely bare because the Germans had taken the furniture. And that then they started to have camps later on to put these guys in. But to get fed, they'd go to a place called Rosemary. I haven't quite worked out exactly where that is yet.
Is this one central point then?
Yeah, in town.
Okay, yeah.
And they'd go there, but there'd be 2,000 of them every hour trying to get fed. So quite often they had problems. Anyway, these guys at the start of November went on strike. Now, you probably think, how on earth did they get away with that? I think the answer is it was early days. They were still they were still nervous about what they were doing in the Channel Islands and not behaving in a particularly unseemly fashion at that point. There was still that wanting to make it look like things aren't so bad under us and all that kind of thing. So I think that's probably why they got away with going on strike. They just refused flatly not getting on the bus, because these guys were actually billeted down at Playholme in the Vale in the north of the island. They had a 6 or 7 mile journey out to Plymouth to go and do some building work out there, and they just went, nope, not getting on. Anyway, they got encouraged onto the buses. I say encouraged, with pistols, I believe.
Yeah.
So they were encouraged at gunpoint onto the buses. But obviously it took them a little while to get out to Plymouth. They decided on the way, we've still not had breakfast, so no, we're not working. And they walked back to Playholme. And there appear to have been no consequences for that.
I mean, look, just for listeners, the walk from Plymouth to Playholme is not the full length of the island, but it's a long way, and it's probably about 5 miles.
Six or 7
miles.
Yeah, something like that.
And if you're hungry and underfed, it's a bit of a trudge. But I suppose if you feel that you're trying to prove a point,
I suppose it's relatively flat. So
it's
one saving grace.
Yeah.
So there was that, and they just walked back to their quarters. Now, a few days later, they obviously were having problems again. So some of them went to town, and the diarist that I've read that records this said they ran amok while singing Le Marseillaise. So much so, they went into a cafe and were causing such a fuss in there that the 2 ladies running the cafe telephoned the police because they were actually quite worried about what was going to happen next. I dare say if they tried that later on in the war, there would have been much worse consequences.
Okay, so these guys went into St. Peter Port. How many are we talking about?
It doesn't say. It just says that they ran amok.
Because it's not widely reported in the diaries that we're sort of mining for information. You're not really expected to see anything in the newspaper about this anyway.
You wouldn't see it. It just wouldn't make the newspaper. The Germans wouldn't publish it.
Exactly. So, yeah, it seems to be quite a significant protest, and yet I've not really heard too much about it myself. So.
No, it was one that surprised me until I started looking at it.
Yeah. Okay, so anything else on the workforce, or are we moving on from there?
I think we'll move on from that one. Yeah. Should we try a little bit of espionage?
Yeah, why not? It's always it's always an interesting topic.
Yeah, so listeners who listened way back to the September, October, November, December 1940 episodes will know we talked about a commando called James Symes who was captured here. He had to surrender in the end after being in hiding for quite some time, gathering lots of intelligence. Well, a relative of his cousin, in fact, gets into a lot of bother in November 1941. Now, when James Symes was here, before he surrendered, he gave Bill Symes, his cousin, a whole load of information that he wanted him to get to London, which my understanding from various sources, including reading some reports where the family have been involved in providing information, he did so with the help of Raymond Fuller, who, again, if you were been listening to earlier episodes, was basically in charge of our buying commission that went to France, and he used to go over there fairly regularly, and somehow got this smuggled out. So that was earlier on. But Bill actually ran a pub in town called The Dive. I have no idea where that was.
Now I've got a feeling this might have been in Fountain Street.
Quite possibly. There were plenty of pubs in Fountain Street
in those days.
Even when I was a teenager, we had a selection of pubs there in Fountain Street. Now, this pub was frequented by a lot of the French captains from the boats that came here with supplies. They used to go and drink there, and Symes was basically using them to route information about what the Germans were up to here back to the UK, some of it going as far down as Spain before it then found its way, or down to Lisbon, by being taken out of the island by these people that were on the supply boats until somebody dobbed him in. Now, we don't know who it was that gave the information which led to him being arrested.
What we mean? We don't know if it was a local person or it could have been somebody on one of the boats or one of the ships.
Well, the only thing we know is, and from all of the reports that I've seen, they all say that he never said who it was. He did say it was someone in a very important role who wanted to appease the Germans.
Okay. So we're thinking it may have been...
I've no idea who.
No, but we're talking about somebody within the government. Well, not the government, but the infrastructure here. Somebody
with a vested interest who was. So he got arrested. He was promptly taken to Jersey. He was also there was a Frenchman that was arrested with him at the same time, and he was taken to Jersey and then very quickly moved on to France. He ends up being bounced around lots of prisons in France, and then he ended up in Buchenwald concentration camp. We don't have any records of the trial that took place, because that took place outside of the Channel Islands, and there just doesn't seem to be any record. But he ended up being bounced around prisons, including Cergy-Midi, which we've talked about before.
Yeah, in Paris. Yeah,
in Paris, where actually some of the Symes family ended up.
Yes, there's an irony there, of course.
Yeah, indeed, that they ended up in the same prison. But yes, he ended up in a concentration camp, was eventually released from the concentration camp in 1944 and sent to Biberach, and then he ended up in Laufen.
Oh, that's interesting. So, somebody actually exiting a concentration camp. Do we know what brought this about? Because effectively, he's not exactly being set free, but by moving from a concentration camp to a detention camp, something must have precipitated this.
Yeah, there were representations made by the British government as far as
really,
and from the information that I've read through the Red Cross, etc., and he was moved.
Oh, well, that's very, very interesting. I've not heard that at all, and that's to the best of your knowledge, Nick. Did that sort of thing, was that a one-off? To try to actually spring somebody from a concentration camp? They must have known he was in the concentration camp in the first place.
Well, I don't know if it's just a case that they didn't know where he was, or whether they did actually know where he was. But then it was, whether it was just a general inquiry about, where is he, sort of thing. But that's, he must be one of the few British nationals to have survived a concentration camp.
Yeah. So just to remind listeners that Biberach and Laufen were detention camps where people from the Channel Islands eventually went to, from 1942, 1943, which we'll get on to in due course. So just to make it plain, this guy's got out of a concentration camp and then moves to detention camp, which would have saved his life, basically.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
So that was an interesting bit. So when people say there was no resistance, I'll be pointing them in that direction, as well as a load of others. I mean, there was an organised group in Jersey. We'll come to them later on in the occupation. Yes. But there was an organised group in Jersey that were also doing a similar sort of.
Yes, it's very important. We're rather sensitive about this, that the charges of no resistance on the island, but there was certainly a severe disobedience and people were putting their lives at risk. That is for sure. Well, I have to say, Nick, I had no idea about that whatsoever.
I've got another little thing, actually, which kind of relates to this, which you may remember a while back, Keith, we talked about customs officers.
Yes.
And we were thinking, why did we need customs officers? You've got taken over the whole island, etc. What's going on there? Because we had that court case of the lady that had got in trouble and she said it was her husband's whiskey that she was smuggling.
Yes.
She wasn't smuggling to flog it. It was her husband's a personal stash, effectively. So I've got to the bottom of this. November 1941. And the French captain of the SS Normand, which was one of the boats that used to ply the shipping routes between here and France, he gets arrested. He's arrested for smuggling, along with a whole load of his crew, and that's because they had these customs officers there to check on this, because there was a lot of stuff turning up. We've talked about it. It turned up on the black market or in the barter shops earlier on, and with dubious provenance as to where it came from. And they found on this particular ship 10,350 packages of cigarette papers, 4,000 packets of baking powder, because, if you're going to do a bit of smuggling, don't forget the baking powder, because there's none of it to be had on the island. It was probably quite valuable. Only 1,180 French cigarettes, which seemed quite low, because those would have changed hands for a lot of money, but the next thing definitely would have changed hands for a lot of money, which was a large quantity of soap. So he gets sentenced to 2 years in prison.
And this is SS Normand. This is French merchant shipping. This is not military shipping.
Yeah, it's French merchant shipping, but it's been pressed into use by the.
So 2 years in prison. Where did he serve that? Do you know?
In France, but I can't remember off the top of my head where he ended up. Another thing that's kind of tied into what we talked about as well in last month's episode was when I was looking through one of the Jersey diaries, 40 pounds of tea in Jersey changed hands for 60 pounds. So that's about 3,200 and something pounds in modern money, or 65 pounds for a pound of tea. And I thought, well, I wonder how that compares. Bearing in mind that it was pretty much impossible to travel into Ireland by this point. I thought, I wonder how that compares to what the one that we looked at in October. It's exactly the same price. So clearly, and then I thought about this a bit harder, and I thought, how did it end up being the same price? And I thought, hang on a minute, there's only one way it would have got there. It's going to have come on the same boat. It'll be the same people flogging it on.
Yeah.
That's how it's been the same price. I assume that's it. Interestingly enough, in the same article, and I'm still trying to get my head around this one. I mentioned this to you on the phone the other day. The chap whose diary it is, Lesotho, who was the manager of a building yard.
And this gentleman is based in Jersey.
Yeah, in Jersey, yeah. And he records in his diary that he'd successfully managed to hide, this is since the start of the occupation, a crane from the Germans.
And not just a crane.
Yeah, a crane and 3 concrete mixers, which he then arranged to smuggle. I mean, how the hell do you smuggle a crane? I mean, it might have been a small crane, but
a crane is a crane.
For you to call it a crane, it's got to be, it's got to be reasonably big. Anyway, he successfully smuggled them somewhere else to stop the Germans getting there, because the Germans were taking over part of his builder's yard. And he was like, hang on a minute, I've got 3 concrete mixers and a crane hidden there. I need to do something.
He probably just made it look like a gun.
Well, yeah, possibly. Who knows? Anyway, but I just thought those were a couple of little interesting diversions.
Well, this guy, Lesotho, is it?
Yeah.
He's I think as you teed him up on the first time we mentioned him, he seems like quite a sort of sardonic kind of chap. It's almost as if he doesn't take things quite that seriously, really.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting take. As I said the last time I mentioned him, he's quite an interesting diarist, because he had no skin in the game post-war in terms of being in a position of power, so being somebody in the government, or or the diaries that you tend to see published, or articles that are published about, these people. He's not got one eye on what's it going to look like post-war. He's just writing a diary just to keep track of what's going on, and he's not bothered about getting involved in a bit of buying stuff on the black market. He's quite open in his diary about the fact that if he's got a bit of cash, he will buy meat on the black market, for example. He doesn't shy away from the fact that he might not be playing it quite by the rules.
We'll be hearing from him right through to 1945?
Yep, absolutely.
Good. Okay, now, the other day when I was out and about, an acquaintance came to see me or came over to talk to me because in November the 5th, 1941, there was a fatal accident. A German NCO was cleaning his revolver. It went off and resulted in the death of a civilian. And Simon, who came over to speak to me, said to me, well, that's one of my relatives. And he sent us, fantastically, quite a lot of information. Would you like to sort of give us the background on that, Nick?
Yeah, I don't know how Simon knew we were thinking about this, because we'd already exchanged messages about this, in that we had the information about somebody being unfortunately killed in this manner, and we had the date, but we didn't have anything else, or I didn't at that point anyway, for sure, and I hadn't got as far as going to try and look at Guernsey presses or anything like that, so quite how Simon knew that we were thinking about
this. But Simon's a journalist, and I think what happened is he'd listened to October 41 and thought, I know what comes next, it's been November.
Quite
anyway,
possibly.
Simon, listen, we're really pleased that you did. So take it away, Nick.
Yeah, so, thanks, Simon. And, of course, you've got a family connection to this as well. So the court report for the incident talks about that this gentleman who was unfortunately killed, Mr. Brouard, he was sat in his lounge on the sofa with his wife, and they were reading a letter by a window. And a shot was heard coming, apparently from a pistol, and the bullet came through the floor, hitting the deceased in the shoulder, passing through and lodging in his body. He fell over sideways with blood coming from his mouth. And it was a German corporal, so an Unteroffizier, who had been cleaning the pistol near a window to get better light, and the cartridge, as it had exploded, as he had removed the magazine, and the bullet passed through the ceiling. Now, I think magazine might not be quite the correct term, because it's a revolver. And all I can think is he hadn't actually started cleaning it yet. He was about to start cleaning it, was pulled it out to try and start taking the bullets out. He records that it was a bit stiff and it sprung back. So it must have sprung back and then...
He was holding the trigger or something.
Yeah, and then unfortunately it went off and killed Mr. Brouard. So yeah, a very sad story. Now, Philip Kuhn, who was the German concerned, told the coroner that he'd been cleaning his revolver on the first floor at about 11:45 a.m. and the magazine was very stiff. He pulled the magazine some way out and then it sprang back, discharging the bullet. And the magistrate, which was a Guernsey civilian magistrate, looked at the evidence and returned a verdict in accordance with that evidence, saying it was a pure accident and no blame was attached to the soldier for that.
Yes, I think one of the pieces of information that Simon passed on to us recorded that the man died in his wife's arms, and he was in his 57.
He was 57, so it rings a bit of a chord with me because he's only about 18 months older than me.
Yeah, and what an awful way to die like that. It was just pure happenstance, and one's almost got some sympathy for the NCO that was doing. I mean, obviously he was negligent. He could just as easily have shot his foot off or something.
Well, there is that. I mean, Ernest Brouard was Duzinier and well respected in the parish, and the newspaper report of his death actually says it cast a gloom over the parish. That's how well liked he was. And,
yes.
And Simon also sent us the court report. The funeral report, which there were 40 wreaths at his funeral. Yeah. And also Simon sent us some photographs as well of some family members, which we'll put the little story about that on the show notes.
Yes.
And so you can see those. Simon's also very kindly agreed that we can use those photographs as well. So we'll put those out.
Yep. Okay, well, so thank you very much, Simon, and thank you for the very kind words about our podcast. Okay, moving on now. We've got a little bit about some RAF aircraft. Got a hot reception going south. Shrapnel fell on the Reverend Ord's garden, just missing him. Got anything on that?
Yeah, so there was quite a lot of aerial activity going on around the area. Not as much as some people in Jersey wanted. So going back to Lesotho again, he actually complains slightly later on in the month that there were approximately 50 ships in or around St Helier Harbour, and that the Guernsey was getting all the bombing, and they were wondering why on earth are we not getting bombed? And he even goes as far as saying he doesn't care if it had been casualties on the civilian side. Now there were a variety of things that were happening here. Some of them were actually definite attacks on shipping around the island or on the island itself. They were trying to be careful not to hit any civilian areas. They tried their best. That's why a lot of the raids where there were attacks on the Channel Islands were quite low level, because they minimised the chances of hitting something they wouldn't. Now, as you mentioned, Reverend Ord was almost hit by a bit of shrapnel. We're back to the what goes up must come down again, and that was a real risk. And people were supposed to leave their front doors unlocked, so you could just go in if there was suddenly an air raid or something like that. You could just go into someone's house.
Yeah, so this shrapnel would have been shrapnel from German ordnance.
Yeah, anti-aircraft fire. So you get bits of it coming back down. I mean, in fact, the only casualty in the Channel Islands on D-Day is a chap who gets killed in Guernsey by a bit of a flak, the shell that comes tumbling down and unfortunately hits him on the head and kills him.
Yeah. So just so we understand what the gentleman in Jersey is saying, is that he's complaining about not being bombed enough.
Yeah, basically because they know that Guernsey's getting bombed and they know all the ships around there are getting bombed, and he's basically complaining they're not getting bombed enough. Now, some of the bombs that fell on Jersey and Guernsey were accidental. You got aircraft returning from a raid in France or wherever, and they drop their bombs because they think they're out over the sea. After all, it's at night. They're probably flying above cloud, etc. They're not entirely certain of their position. I was listening to another podcast, a very good one called Never Mind the Dam Busters, earlier this week, and they talked about a crew that thought they were heading home and found themselves to be almost in Switzerland, which would have been a bit of a disaster. So, they weren't always certain of their position. So they sometimes jettison bombs and things like that. But all sorts of things like that, really.
So Jersey feeling a little bit left out there.
Yeah, they've not got enough of what we've got. You can kind of see where he's coming from. It must have been particularly galling if you know that the shipping around Guernsey is getting bombed to blazes, and you've got all these German ships just sitting there, and seemingly no one's doing anything about it. You'd probably be a bit.
Well, there's more than a grain of truth about that, and there must have been some reason why, or lack of planning or whatever. But
you are 30 miles further south, and it's potentially, not knowing that the window of opportunity is a lot less because French coast to Jersey is a lot closer.
Yeah.
They probably thought they had a better chance of getting the shipping when it's on its way to Guernsey. Who knows?
Okay, now the other thing here is we had a change at the top of the military hierarchy in Guernsey. Schumacher was replaced by Colonel Nakfus.
Yeah, Nakfus was actually based in Jersey. We talked about him a tiny bit last month. He was based in Jersey, but he was basically in charge of the Feldkommandantur, so that's the civilian bit of it, effectively.
So it's sort of civilian, I think you put here civilian affairs department, so it's government liaison, would that be right?
Well, yeah, no, just like the bureaucratic bit, which basically the German layer of government, effectively. So they made up all the rules that the civilians had to follow, that kind of stuff. And so you had more than one commandant. You had the Feldkommandant or commandant who was basically in charge of civilian affairs, and then you had the fortress commandant, so the one that's in charge of the military side of the operation. So Nakfus replaced Schumacher, who we talked about last month would appear under some form of nervous breakdown or similar because he had news that his family had all been killed in Hamburg. Schumacher nobody thought he was particularly bad. However, Nakfus was another kettle of fish, shall we say. He was described by one of the Jersey diarists, Edward Lecain, as being an overbearing Nazi type who liked to be as nasty as possible to those that he had at his mercy. And he's described also as being a bald, rotund man with a monocle.
Some people's archetype of a sort of middle-ranking German officer. Well, he was quite senior-ranking German officer, I suppose. And then he left. He was here for a little while, or was on Channel Islands for a little while, up to about March 44 or something.
Yeah, he was here from 1941 until March 44, and much like many Germans, perhaps with an eye on what might be about to happen, things aren't going so well, started making some anti-Nazi comments. And obviously word got around to sufficiently high places, and he was carted off and court-martialed in France. We're not entirely sure what happened to him, but it is pretty much believed that he died in Russia.
Yeah, I mean, there was the Hitler assassination plot was July 1944, so this preceded that, but there was a lot of sort of investigations into people, and the temperature sort of rose, those that were making what were perceived to be anti-Nazi or anti-Hitler remarks. So this actually predates the Hitler assassination attempt, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but the thing was that the way that Hitler liked to work, he liked to set people up to be in competition with each other. So you'd have the army and the navy in competition with each other because he liked to divide them and keep control of things himself, which then meant that sort of thing happened even between men of the same branch of the military services and things like that. So they'd start fighting amongst them, infighting amongst themselves and trying to outdo each other or cause problems for each other if they thought it was going to get them ahead of the game. So I suspect that's probably what happened in this case.
Okay. People still have their radios at this stage, so they're still listening to the BBC. People are picking up on BBC reports of of an E-boat sinking on the way to Guernsey and many drowned. But this doesn't necessarily translate into being reported on the island in terms of people being interred here. I mean, people dying at sea in the vicinity of the Channel Islands. There's no real sort of linkage. You know, if a ship is at sea off the coast of the Channel Islands and anything happens to it, the sailors drown, unfortunately. But these aren't people that are buried on the island, and there's nothing, I couldn't pick up anything in the Kriegsmarine deaths here.
No, and I couldn't find anything in particular. There is an account of a convoy being attacked in one of the unpublished diaries, Ambrose Robin's diary, and he talks, I've turned this up since we last talked about this earlier in the week, that the attack occurred 3/4 of a mile east of Platte-Fougere Lighthouse, so quite close to the coast of Guernsey.
Yeah.
A convoy of ships further east in the Great Russell was probably attacked just before this. This E-boat left St. Peter Port a quarter of an hour before she was attacked and was proceeding north after being machine gunned and bombed. She was on fire and helpless. Some minesweepers in St. Peter Port fetched her in. Now, I'm imagining he probably saw a lot of this because he worked in town. He worked at the top of Berthlet Street. So he probably had a fairly good view.
Panoramic view, yeah.
Yeah, he probably had a fairly good view. He either worked, I haven't quite narrowed down the building yet, but he worked at the top of Berthlet Street / Lefevre Street. So he was somewhere around that area. So he probably could see this. Certainly the way he's written it, it certainly sounds like he saw it rather than, he was told it by someone else. Now, the bit that he was perhaps told it by somebody else was the ambulances were busy for more than an hour, and a fair number of Germans had died. Now we've talked about that, and we can't find anything that shows that was the case. But it might be that they were taken to France and died there.
Yeah.
And who knows? It's very, very difficult. And some of these stories as well, and I think we've mentioned this before, as they get passed round, it starts off with one German was killed, and by the time you get, it's 27th hand, there's 30 that have been machine gunned and whatever. And another thing that I've noticed in some of the accounts as well, because you can read, several accounts, maybe 5, 6, 7 different accounts of the same event, and it's all slightly different in terms of exactly what happened to the poor unfortunate that was the victim of whatever happened. So there was a chap who walked into a minefield, German major, walked into a minefield at Roost, didn't realise, this was in November 41 as well, didn't realise that the minefield had been activated by his men, walked into it to go and inspect their work, unsurprisingly got blown up by an S-mine, which is those horrible ones that bounce up to sort of about 3 foot off the ground and go off and fire ball bearings everywhere. I mean, I say a nasty one. I mean, all landmines are nasty, but that's going to cause you a whole lot of problems. He was actually rescued by the sergeant who came back because the men had all gone away for lunch. This is why he just wandered in. He didn't know it was activated. I've got a copy of the minefield map. You look at it, and it was activated the day before. Yeah, it's dated on there. Now, when you look at some of the diary entries for this, he actually got taken to the hospital. He died several days later of his wounds. It was a chap called Major Blaschek, I think you pronounce his name. I'm not very good with pronouncing German names. So, he was clearly rescued. He was rescued from the minefield and taken to the hospital. But you see a number of the reports, including in this one in the diary, saying a day or two ago, a German, 2 or 3 men laying mines. So it's already gone from one person to 2 or 3 were blown to smithereens when laying mines, and exploded so much that not a particle was left.
Yeah.
So you often see that I don't know if it's just they wish that these things had happened. That when they get the reports of, 20 Germans were killed, and actually it turns out there was 1, or something like that during an air raid or whatever. I don't know if it's that they wish that more of them had been killed.
Yes, and with this one, you mentioned it was Roos, which is an area on the northwest coast of Guernsey, just on the edge of a large bay called Grand Havre. I know that right towards the end of the war, this may have been approaching the end of the winter months in early 1945, a gentleman decided that the Achtung Minen signs that had been put up were there. Basically there were no mines whatsoever, and he was going to go down to the seashore to find something to eat, and he himself stepped on a mine and was killed. So these minefields, there were some accidents amongst the military when they were being laid, but after a while, everything settled down. People stayed away, but there was a sort of belief in some people is that the Germans had just put signs out, and there really wasn't any mines there whatsoever. And people were so desperate for food that they themselves, this gentleman included, decided that they would chance it.
Yeah, I mean the other thing later on in the war with the minefields was they actually started, because they'd run out. They didn't have more supplies of mines to it. If they changed their mind about where they wanted to put a minefield for whatever reason to defend the island, they were taking up an existing minefield and then moving it to somewhere else. So, perhaps people thought, oh, well, they've taken all of that minefield away, and actually they might have only taken a bit of it away. Who knows? It's just one of those things, really.
Now, the other thing that's, again, people are starting to notice perceptibly their own and other people's health is really starting to deteriorate. The Reverend Ord, who we refer to often, reports spells of dizziness due to the lack of calories, and at one stage says that whilst he was delivering a sermon, he had this wave of nausea and dizziness came upon him, and he had to grip hold of the furniture around him because he thought he was going to collapse. And then also many people in hospital with muscular problems, and again a wide outbreak of dysentery. Yeah,
dysentery was a problem for quite some time during the occupation, and it caused real problems.
And diarists, a whole raft of them, commenting on there was a potato shortage.
Yeah.
There wasn't that much to eat, and then the potato ration went right down.
Now, the potato thing is, the Germans try and wheedle their way out of this one. So what happened was the Germans commandeered local civilian supplies of potatoes, about 40 tons in Guernsey's case. And they did the same in Jersey. I can't remember what the tonnage was in Jersey. So they commandeered them, and basically it was, can you lend us some potatoes? You didn't really have a lot of choice. Basically, they were told, you are lending us some potatoes and we'll replace them. They didn't. So, of course, this caused a massive shortage. What did the Germans do? They blamed the potato growers. They said they'd made false claims on their returns of how many potatoes they were growing.
These would have been potatoes that were grown on the islands.
Yeah. And
so it just so happened that potato growers in Guernsey and Jersey decided to do this without talking to one another.
Yeah, absolutely. They couldn't talk to each other because you couldn't phone into Ireland or anything like that. If you were just, Mr. LePage down the Vale who grows to you're not going to be phoning up some chap out in Gorey, to inquire how his potato crop's doing or anything like that. So they couldn't possibly have come up with the same idea. We're gonna vastly inflate the what we return. And why would they have done that? It's just completely counterintuitive, because we already know that the Germans were basically saying, okay, we're having X% of everything you grow. So why would you say, you'd be doing it the other way round, wouldn't you? You'd be saying, oh no, I'm only growing, 20 tons of potatoes, when actually you're growing 40, because you're going to keep the other 20 for yourself. You just wouldn't. So that's what they did, and they never replaced them, and that's what caused potatoes were a massive problem throughout the occupation, despite the potato peel society.
And also gas restrictions. Well, gas restrictions for civilians at any rate.
Yeah, two-tier gas. By the sounds of it, and again going back to Ambrose Robin, he talks in his diary. So the Germans have published a notice in the paper, or got the gas company to publish a notice in the paper, which basically says you're limited in the hours that you're allowed to use your gas. You are actually also limited in the quantity of gas that you could use in a week. It was done on cubic feet or whatever. So he went and walked past his house that had been commandeered by the Germans up in George Road. He went for a walk. I think it was the day after that notice had been in the paper. And bearing in mind, it was a particularly harsh November. All of the diaries talk about it being very, very cold, apart from a few days where they record that the weather was somewhat better. And he walks past his house, Selborne. I must go and have a look and see if I actually see where that house is. And he notices through the window that the Germans have had gas fires installed in the fireplaces, and that they are burning flat out during the time when you're not supposed to be using your gas.
Yes, well, one rule for them and one rule for us.
And that, again, is a recurring theme. I've seen numerous references of the Germans just not caring, and they've got, heating going flat out, even when they potentially didn't really need it to be going flat out. And, that's just one of those things that you read about reasonably often.
Now, Alderney, Spitfires,
yeah,
or the crashing thereof.
Indeed, two crash in Alderney. One on the 2nd of November 1941 from number 234 Squadron RAF. That was piloted by an American, actually, pilot officer B.W. Mayer. He crash landed in Alderney and was sent to Stalag Luft 3, which those of you who like the Great Escape War movie will know that is the camp.
That's the very camp. Yeah.
The Great Escape took place from.
And as we approach Boxing Day, we might spot him in the film.
Well, I don't think he gets a mention by name. But
so how did this, was he shot down, or was it a forced landing? Or
I'm not sure in the case of that one, actually. There was another one. How unlucky is this?
Yeah, but this later in the month. They're only connected insofar it's all in the Spitfires. they're not on the same raid or anything like that.
No. Two different squadrons. 6 days later, another Spitfire this time from 501 Squadron, piloted by pilot officer W.J.H. Greenaway, crashed on a beach in Alderney. That was on Bray Beach that he crashed, and the Germans recovered the Spitfire and carted it off to go and look at it. They did that quite a bit, actually. They take them back to Germany and take them to France initially, and then onwards to Germany, and in some cases put them back together. There was one that crashed in Jersey later on in the occupation, which became known as the Franken Spitfire, because they took it to Germany and then they tried and test flew it, because it was basically it was a forced landing rather than an actual crash.
Yes.
They repaired it, took it to Germany, and then they test flew it and then put some German engines in it to try it with German engines and various other things that became known as the Franken Spitfire.
No, like Frankenstein sort of thing.
Yeah, so I checked, and neither of these guys, I couldn't find to hand a list of absolutely everybody that was involved in the Great Escape. I found a couple of lists. Couldn't see these guys on it.
Because the thing is that both these guys survived. Both of them, in both instances, they survived.
Yeah, they both end up in Stalag Luft 3. Yeah. I couldn't find them on the list of being involved in the escape, but they may well have been involved in some way, shape or form. I did, however, check, and they weren't one of the 50-odd that were murdered by the Germans after the escape.
Well, not everybody in the camp could have been involved in this.
Absolutely.
Right, so, well, that's, with Alderney, that brings Alderney into the frame.
There was also a rumour going around that a Wellington bomber had crashed on Alderney. Now, I can find no evidence of that.
No, that's right. It's one of those myths.
I think it's just one of those myths and speculation. There might have been one that crashed near it. I can't find a record of a Wellington crashing near there. That said, the list that I've got, I have found gaps in it, when I've been going through other records where I found things. So it may well be that there's there was one that crashed near Alderney or something like that.
Well, okay. Well, look, we were talking just before we came on air. It looks like we've got a number of guests that we will be recording specials on during the early part of 2025. Got some quite interesting things based around language and about some of the more legal aspects of what was going on.
Which is quite an interesting aspect of things, and I find it quite confusing at times. I do have to ask people about that. So that we've got those. We're going to have our regular episodes coming up as well. So it will be carrying on month by month.
Yeah, if we'd have really been organised, we'd have been doing December 41 now. But we're not going to get to December until January, are we?
Well, we'll get to, I mean, it will be early January, so December will Christmas will still be in the mind, I should imagine, albeit you might be a little bit fed up about it. While I think about it, I must also give a mention to a podcast that's really, really good that is run by a chap called Kevin Getz and another chap whose name is Andy, and I apologise, Andy, I've forgotten your surname. It's called Ham and Jam, and it's everything you basically want to know about the British Airborne Forces during World War II. I've been listening to it, and it's really good. So I can highly recommend that. And they're only on about episode 4 at the moment, so you've got plenty of time to catch up. But well worth a listen.
Yep, excellent. Well, also your blog's on.
It's still going. Yes.
Yeah. So what's the latest topics there?
I've almost finished another article about, which kind of follows on for something I talked to Jim Delbridge on BBC Guernsey a few weeks ago about, which was how the treatment of neutral nationals, what exactly happened to them. And I've turned up a few other bits and pieces since I spoke to Jim that I've come across. So I've got a little article going on about that. But at the moment, my main focus is the book.
The book.
The deadline is looming. Although I did get contacted, and Sunday afternoon I went and met a lovely lady who had a whole load of information for me about an escape that no one has written about, which will be in the book. And I'm not saying any more than that. But I met her and her son, who also he knows a lot about the occupation as well. And I popped round for. We'd said, if you've got half an hour, and I think I left 2.5 hours later. They're absolutely fascinating chat. So working hard on the book. I've got a week off over Christmas, and most of that will be writing.
Yeah, and I was doing some research in the UK 2 or 3 weeks ago, and the fruit of that is that some diaries, war journals, as part of a wider range archive, is now being lodged with Cambridge University, and they're going to extract the war journals towards the summer of 2025, and they're from a significant source. So we're hoping I put your name forward, Nick, as one of the scholars to have a look through, and that's really good news, because I can't at this moment say who the diaries or journals were written by, but we'll be able to release that information going forward. One of the things, Nick, that we've been really surprised about is during the course of doing this podcast, and we've been going since what? February of this year.
Yep.
And it's the amount of information that's come to light. People have volunteered for us and turned out to be relevant and significant. And you're finding that with regard to your book, but also for this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And people get in touch, and quite often the conversations that they'll send me an email or drop me a message on Facebook or Twitter, and they'll say, "You're probably not interested in this."
Yeah, that seems to be the way that people open the conversation.
It's just a minor thing, yeah. Or I don't know if this is true, but my granddad told me this, or my dad told me this, or if they were a child. A couple of them, been people that were relatively small children at the time of the occupation, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm not sure if I remember this right, but did this happen?" Or, "Do you know anything about this?" And or "I'm sure you're not interested, but I've got some papers that relate to this," and well, I'm definitely interested, because I'll come and have a look and see, because just the smallest fragment of information can lead you onwards to something completely different. I've had somebody that sent me, and it's not just from Guernsey and Jersey either, which is brilliant, because I've had people that have found stuff in as far away as Canada and America, and have said, look, I've been listening to your podcast. My great aunt lived in Guernsey, but she emigrated after the war, and we've got this pile of papers. I'm sure you won't be interested in them, but if you are, I'll photograph them and send them to you. And it's like, oh, of course I'm interested. And there's been some great stuff that's come out of that.
Yeah, one has to try and find a very polite way of saying we'll be the judge of that.
Yeah, well, indeed. And of course, it probably doesn't help that Guernsey folk are well known for their travelling around the world. We like to move to different countries and things like that. So Guernsey folk are spread all over the world. There are quite a lot in Canada, America, and Australia, etc. And again, I had somebody else contact me from Australia about an escape. It kind of sounds like it could be quite interesting, because I already had down the exact dates that he's mentioned, an escape, roughly where it was from, but I had no other information. And I knew the number of people involved, but I had no other information. He contacted me out of the blue, and he wouldn't have found this information. I got this from a source that is well buried. Unless you were specifically looking, you wouldn't have found this. And the dates will tie up, the number of people, the rough location, and he's got some papers relating to that, and it looks quite interesting, and he's in the process of scanning those and sending them to me.
Well, if anyone has got information, the slightest thing, then you can get hold of us at occupied@gnetradio.com. Okay, so this is going to be our last episode of 2024, although it's November 1941. We'll be back in the new year with December 1941.
Indeed, we might sneak another one in, because I've already recorded a special with my friend Kerry, who came over to visit Guernsey, and he very kindly agreed to be interviewed, did it remotely, because he's back in Wales now. But Kerry came on and gave us a perspective of what it's like for somebody who hadn't been to Guernsey before, and bless him, he did get an entire weekend of the occupation of Guernsey with a bit of Napoleonic stuff thrown in, but basically it was a whistle-stop tour.
And I missed him, so
yeah, unfortunately. So I've recorded that. We might put that one out. It's up, a half-hour special. So
yeah,
I'll get that edited up, and perhaps we'll put that out shortly after Christmas. So once you're fed up of all the Christmas movies and all that stuff, maybe I'll try and get it out for Boxing Day or the day after, and then if you're a bit bored of the movies, you can
tune into that, and you'll put that out on social media.
Yeah, I'll put it out on social media. So that's another good reason to actually go and follow us, because obviously we go out first on Gnet Radio, but we do have the odd sort of short special that we do where it doesn't quite fit with putting it into the Gnet, because it's a little bit of a shorter episode, or not kind of the main thing that we do. So we occasionally put them out. So I would encourage you to go and track us down on your favourite podcast app, and do hit the follow or subscribe button on whatever it is. It's completely free to do so. And that way you won't miss any episodes. But also give our social media a follow as well. We're at Islands at War on Twitter. You can find us Islands at War on Facebook as well, or follow myself, Nick Luke.
Well, the latest stats, we're bigging ourselves up here, but the latest stats were very encouraging. We got over 6,800.
Oh, we're well past that now. We're 7,000 something now.
Oh dear!
But yeah, I was well chuffed the other day when the stats came in. Our podcast host that we use that distributes the podcast to all the apps and everything for us and hosts the website, etc. It's called Buzzsprout. They've got 121,790, I think it is. Certainly 121,000 something active podcasts around the world, and we're in the top 25% for 2024.
Well,
so
we can only.
I was well chuffed with that.
Yeah, and we can only be in that position because of our loyal listeners. So we're going to sort of say thank you and goodbye, but also wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And as I say, Nick will possibly put out a Kerry special, if we can put it that way. But
yeah, happy Christmas to you all, and hope you all have a very enjoyable Christmas, and we'll be back in the new year.
Yep. So thank you very much, and we'll go out with a bit of Jim, of course.
À la prochaine.
À la prochaine.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.